Hello and welcome to ETH Insights exclusive interview series. Today we have with us Mr. Pradeep Sekhar. He's the Managing Director of Optiv Securities. Pradeep, thanks for taking the time out and speaking to ETH Insights.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have you. Pradeep, let me begin by asking you, the entire supply chain security, it's in threat because of the ongoing geopolitical crisis. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war and now the Gaza conflict.
Yep.
And we've seen that powerful economies are no longer the driving force for supply chain management. It's the geopolitical tensions that are literally driving the supply chain management. So, what are the lessons that organizations can take from these conflicts, and how can they streamline their processes to ensure that geopolitical conflicts don't affect the supply chain security system?
Sure, that's a great question to kick off the conversation, right? So in this world, everywhere we turn, we're starting to see geopolitical conflicts shaping multiple things. But one of the things that is also getting impacted is supply chains, right? And what we've seen is in the past several years, global supply chains have faced systemic shocks. And it started all the way back from when the US-China trade war started, right? And then came the COVID-19 pandemic. Like you rightly called out, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Now, all of these have sent shock waves through the entire supply chain ecosystem. And countries and organizations are starting to grapple with and trying to understand how to manage this, because the world is no longer the same, right? Now, all of this has caused, I would say, a huge amount of uncertainty and volatility in the world. And even, for example, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, right, it impacted manufacturing, it impacted logistics, and even consumer demand. But that's when the first time we saw cascading impacts of what supply chain disruptions could cause, right? What happened with the semiconductor industry and their shortage of chips, and the impact it had on automotive and the whole technology industry as well, that was revelatory, right? Now, all of this is from a broader supply chain that we typically look at, right? Now, to complicate things further, we are also seeing cyber attacks on the rise, right? So I'll start with examples from 2021 because that's where we've seen a lot of ransomware attacks happening. So JBS is the world's largest meat producer. They suffered a huge ransomware attack in 2021, right? And this impacted beef production in the United States, in Canada, and Australia. And this quickly came on the heels of another ransomware attack, which basically impacted Colonial Pipeline. And that is a company that is supplying gasoline to the whole of the eastern part of the United States, right? It drove up gas prices across the board. And this is what we typically call, when you look at the broader supply chain aspect, right? So one other thing that usually gets missed is a software supply chain, right? And end of 2020 was I would say, a landmark incident that happened, which is the SolarWinds, right? Now, this is a software which basically organizations use to manage their internal networks. A malicious package that was there that companies downloaded as part of an update package unknowingly led to bad actors, threat actors having remote backdoor entry access into each of these organizations, right? So thousands of organizations, both private sector, government agencies in the US and in Europe got impacted because of this. So it is very clear right now that we are in a very dangerous scenario wherein there is this overlap of cyber attacks and supply chains, and it is becoming even more important not for national security, as important as it is for economics as well, right? So all of these have basically taught organizations, business leaders a number of lessons, right? But going back to your question on what are some of the key lessons we have learned. So one is, as organizational leaders and businesses, we've learned that we need to be prepared for such scenarios, for crisis. How do we manage a crisis? We need to be prepared for having a good contingency plan in place, right? If this were to happen again, how do I respond? We need to have good protocols on how do I rapidly respond and rapidly recover from such scenarios, right? Now, all of this is basically put leaders in a scenario where we are calling an assume breach mentality, right? So leaders are starting to already assume that, yes, there's a good chance I might be breached, so let me prepare for how do I respond to it, right? So all of these have been critical lessons that have taught business leaders on how to respond
Right.
in the scenario of geopolitical conflicts from a supply chain perspective.
Right. Interestingly, you talked about the leaders coming together and, the preparedness.
Yeah.
But another important aspect in this scenario is the stakeholders. Now, there has to be a substantial collaboration and partnerships globally, I mean, to get this thing in order.
Yep.
So, with regards to the supply chain security, how important is a collaboration and partnership globally, and how can organizations proceed with this kind of a cooperation?
Okay, yeah. That's very timely as well, right? Because that's something that we have been, at least in InfoSec community, we've been talking about how to have a good global collaboration, information sharing. But I think it's the need of the hour, right? And rightly so. The reason I say that is if you look at bad actors, right? Threat actors, cyber criminals, they are amazingly well connected, right? If you look at how connected they are on the dark web, underground chat forums, they also have, they provide subscription-based model services as well, right? If you go to the dark web today for, I would say, $40 a month, you could go and get ransomware as a service, you can get malware as a service, and to the extent that they provide customer services to other threat actors and bad actors, right? So that's how connected and well prepared they are. So the need of the hour for us as, let's say, the good folks, right, on the business side, business leaders, security leaders, is for us to also have those collaborative approach, also to have open information sharing, right? Because we need to know what are the critical threat information that is out there. We need to know what risk mitigation strategies worked for, let's say, organizations that went through this crisis, as well as, let's say, other companies in a particular industry that went through that, right? What worked and what did not. As well as what are some of the vital resources we should have access to or should even know about, right? So those are things I would say is absolutely essential for us today. So one good example that I can call out is the Quad cybersecurity partnership, right? So this is amongst the 4 countries, the US, Japan, India, and Australia. But one of the good things to come out of that is their focus, right? So they have like 3 main focus areas called out. So one is critical infrastructure protection. The other one is supply chain resilience and security. And the third one is software security standards. Now, different countries within this Quad group, they are basically taking the lead on putting a thought paper and a blueprint on what should they do in each of these areas. The motive is by putting this out there, it becomes a call to action for other countries who can then take it and internalize within their own countries, right? So the whole goal of this is through this international collaboration, we start putting out what are the cybersecurity best practices, what are supply chain security best practices. So that at the end of the day, what we would want to do is put together a good framework and a blueprint so that supply chain security is secure for all the actors involved in that supply chain.
Interestingly, you talked about Quad. Well, there are countries who also believe that it also puts away the China threat, in perspective. But one more interesting thing is the preparedness, what you were talking about. So what are some of these emerging technologies in the supply chain security space? I mean, when we talk about the cyber threats, that helps in preparedness of threats that are coming for organizations.
Yeah, sure. So, so out of all the supply chain incidents that's happened, right? So that start, I would say, business leaders and supply chain managers, I would say, good foundational material on what to focus on. So we have seen a number of trends in terms of both how business and security approach supply chain. Right, from the business aspect of it, we are seeing them more favoring more towards, I would say, supply chain redesign. Right, they're focusing more on diversification. They're focusing more on strategic resource acquisition. They are also focusing on, like you rightly said, technology implementation. Right, so when it comes to, I would say, supply chain redesign, companies, organizations, they're starting to look at restructuring their supply chain. Right, they're focusing on, could we do regionalization? Could we do backshoring? Could we move away from the just-in-time delivery models, which is what was ruling pretty much the whole of the supply chain industry today? Because whenever there is a geopolitical conflict or a tension, the first thing to go is all those companies that are focused on the just-in-time model, right? So they're trying to see how to diversify from that, right? That's where diversification also comes from, right? Can we expand our supplier base? Can we move to countries that are safer, more reliable, like the China Plus One strategy that companies have started to implement? We're also seeing strategic resource acquisition, wherein this is a very critical asset that you need, you stockpile on those, right? For example, semiconductor chips. Now with the US elections just around the corner, You don't know what trade restrictions are going to come in.
Absolutely.
Right? You also don't know what are the new geopolitical conflicts is going to come. Right. So companies are starting to pile up on semiconductor chips in anticipation of those disruptions.
Right.
The other one with respect to technology is with the advent of new technologies, companies are starting to use blockchain, artificial intelligence, of course, to see how we can make the whole supply chain more transparent.
Right.
How we can increase visibility, right? So that all the players involved can basically help get better prepared with that.
Right.
From a cyber perspective, what it is influencing the security leaders to do and also the business leaders is, now all organizations globally we have seen they're having more and more dependency on third parties, suppliers. Right. Now if you look at third parties, now they also have their own third parties, we call them fourth parties, and it's basically turtles all the way down, right? So we call them nth party risks. So organizations need to ensure and find out who are those most critical out of those, right? Because the same 20-80 principle, right? So you have 20% of suppliers who would have the 80% of impact on your business, as well as to your business operations.
Right.
So identifying, prioritizing them is going to be key. So that's something that we are looking at organizations are also doing in terms of identifying and doing continuous monitoring, evaluation of the suppliers and the risk posture, so that they know that they can mitigate any risks that might come from them. Right? So I would say all of this is helping security and business leaders try to be better prepared to mitigate and minimize the risks that might come from supply chain disruptions.
Right. So ultimately, this entire ecosystem is being made resilient with all these, efforts being put into. So I just wanted to understand, how do you see the landscape evolving in the next 4 or 5 years with respect to cybersecurity, the supply chain landscape?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So from a supply chain standpoint, the way we are looking at it, and again, I would say it's Broad, but we would want, and every organization, they're also started to look at this way, right? So supply chain itself, you can divide into, so we can look at it in 3 lenses. So one is what traditionally we look at as the physical or the hardware components of a supply chain, like what runs the whole logistics portion of it, the manufacturing, the goods involved, finished goods, what have you. The next aspect which is becoming a key player is the software side of it, right? Which is software supply chain, right? Because software components and the build that you have in those software projects and the different packages, all of that we need to have a pretty good foothold in terms of how it's getting built today. And the last part and the third part I would say is the service provider, the supplier supply chain, right? So today if you look at the extended footprint, when you look at hardware suppliers, those who are supplying hardware materials, as well as even the suppliers or service providers, now that is spanning countries, if not continents. Right? What it makes it even more murkier is basically when you add the software component to it, right? Because like I said, software, when you look at software the way they are built, it is not completely closed source, right? Any software, they use third-party libraries. They use open source packages and open source projects. Now all of these are building in and producing or emanating new vulnerabilities. So we need to be prepared for those, right? So, so from a cybersecurity standpoint, I'm saying we are seeing basically risks from all of these, but in the trend that we are seeing is more and more coming from the software side of things, right? And one of the things that basically helped drive more focus towards it is US President's executive order, right? It's 14028, which basically said to have a software bill of materials, like how we have a hardware bill of materials. For software, we need to have a software bill of materials, right? And the US government, being a very big consumer of technology, it has that buying power, right? So it's basically saying, if you need to do business with me, the federal government, you need to have a software bill of materials, right? So what we are seeing and what we're seeing organizations and security leaders, supply chain managers do is starting to focus more on identifying what my supply chain is, right? So the key trends we are seeing, I would say, is some of the global organizations we're working with, they are starting to design bots, right? To basically scan their internal enterprise network to see what information do we have about suppliers, right? Because one of the other challenges that we've seen from an organizational perspective is supply chain used to be the territory of procurement, right? But increasingly so, we see other teams coming in, playing a role as well. For example, legal is coming in, because each of these critical suppliers, they need to ensure contracts are in place, the right set of contracts, right set of contractual clauses. So legal is playing an active role. Security is playing a role, because some of these suppliers have access to organization networks, access to sensitive data, PII. So it's becoming like a trifecta now, right? So you need to also manage this 3 different stakeholders involved to effectively manage your supply chain. Right. So it's becoming a pretty nice trend, I would say. But that's where we are seeing all of this going towards, right? So with automated technologies, tooling in place, being able to automate supply chain security audits, because once you identify who the critical suppliers are, you need to ensure that you continue to evaluate them periodically. So there's a lot of third-party risk management tools and platforms out there that can be used to automate that particular process, right? So going forward, we see all of these fundamental building blocks helping put a good blueprint and a framework for organizations to follow to ensure there is secure supply chain across the board.
Right. On that note, Pradeep, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. It was truly enlightening, and I wish you all the best for all the work that you've been doing and going to do in the future. Thank you very much.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.